There are places on this earth where silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a living, breathing presence. The Alaskan interior in February of 1987 was such a place. I stood at the edge of the frozen Kayakuk River, 30 miles north of Bettles, and felt that silence press against my eardrums like water pressure at depth. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I had come to this godforsaken corner of the Brooks Range for one reason only: to disprove a legend. I was a glaciologist by training, 34 years old, with a reputation for methodical research and an absolute intolerance for pseudoscience. The University of Alaska Fairbanks had sent me to study ice core samples from the region, hoping to gather climate data dating back thousands of years. What I did not expect, what I could never have anticipated, was that I would become part of the very mythology I dismissed. The cold here was not like the cold I had experienced in my previous expeditions to Greenland or Antarctica. This was a malevolent cold, the kind that found every gap in your clothing, every moment of weakness in your concentration. At minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, my breath crystallized instantly, forming a tiny cloud of ice particles that fell like glitter to the snow at my feet. The sound of my boots crunching through the crusted snow was the only interruption to the oppressive quiet. I had established base camp 2 days prior, a small research station consisting of a weatherproof tent, scientific equipment, and enough supplies for 3 weeks. My radio had worked perfectly during the flight in, during the setup, during my first night. It was only on the morning of the 3rd day that it began to fail, spitting static and garbled voices before falling silent altogether. I told myself it was the cold affecting the batteries, nothing more. The native guide who had flown me in, a Koyukon man named Joseph, had warned me about this area. "The old ones say this valley is watched," he had said, his weathered face serious beneath his fur-lined hood. "They say the guardians live here, in the deep places where the sun never reaches in winter." I had nodded politely, made a note in my journal about local folklore, and dismissed it as the superstition of isolated communities. I was a scientist. I dealt in measurable facts, in data that could be replicated and verified. How arrogant I was. The work consumed my days. I would wake before dawn, force down a breakfast of freeze-dried eggs and instant coffee, then trudge out to my drilling sites. The ice here was ancient, compressed under its own weight into layers that told stories of atmospheric composition, volcanic eruptions, and climate shifts spanning millennia. Each core sample I extracted was a triumph of patience and precision. But there were moments, brief intervals between the mechanical drone of the drill and the scrape of ice against metal, when I would feel it. A sensation of being observed. Not the casual awareness of wildlife nearby, but something more focused, more intelligent. I would straighten up, scan the tree line of stunted black spruce and skeletal birch, and see nothing. The mountains rose around me like the walls of a cathedral, their peaks lost in perpetual cloud. Nothing moved in that landscape except the occasional raven, its black wings stark against the white. On the 4th day, I found the first sign. I had ventured further from camp than usual, following a promising geological formation that suggested older ice deposits. The snow here was deeper, untouched, a perfect blanket of white that recorded every movement across its surface. And there, crossing a small clearing between 2 clusters of spruce, were tracks. They were not bear tracks. I had studied bear tracks extensively during my field training. These were different. Each print was massive, easily 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions and what appeared to be an opposable digit, like a thumb. The stride length was enormous, suggesting a bipedal creature of considerable height. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old, the edges still sharp and unaffected by wind. I knelt beside them, my scientific mind racing through possibilities. A deformity in a bear? Highly unlikely given the consistent pattern. A hoax? Impossible, given my isolation and the fact that no one knew my exact location beyond base camp. I pulled out my Nikon F3, the camera that had documented dozens of research sites across the polar regions, and photographed the prints from multiple angles. The click and whir of the film advance was unnaturally loud in the silence. That was when I smelled it. It was not a smell I could easily describe. Imagine the musk of a wet animal, concentrated and aged, mixed with something sulfurous and organic, like rotting vegetation and mineral deposits. It was thick enough to taste, coating the back of my throat and making my eyes water. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on a wind I could not feel. I stood quickly, too quickly, and my vision swam from the altitude and sudden movement. The treelines seemed to pulse and shift. Shadows that should not have existed in the flat winter light appeared to move between the trunks. My rational mind insisted it was hypoxia, dehydration, fatigue. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming a single word: run. I did not run. Instead, I marked the location with a fluorescent surveying flag, took compass bearings, and returned to camp with measured, deliberate steps. That night, I wrote in my journal, discovered unusual tracks approximately 2.3 kilometers northeast of base camp. Unknown origin. Require further investigation. I did not mention the smell. I did not mention the sensation of being watched that had intensified to the point where I could feel it as a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. If you're drawn into Marcus's journey into the unknown, subscribe to hear more true encounters from the edges of our world. The truth is waiting in the silence. Sleep became difficult. The tent, which had seemed secure and warm, now felt like paper stretched over a frame. Every creak of the poles in the wind, every shift of snow sliding from the roof, brought me to full alertness. I kept my hunting knife within reach, though what good a 6-inch blade would do against whatever had made those tracks, I could not say. On the 6th day, I found the structure. I had returned to the site of the tracks, determined to follow them to their source. The trail led deeper into the valley, away from any known human settlement, into a region that appeared on my topographical maps as blank space labeled simply unexplored terrain. The tracks were joined by others, multiple sets, suggesting a group moving together with purpose and coordination. The structure appeared suddenly, as if the landscape had chosen that moment to reveal it. It was constructed from stripped logs, each easily 20 feet long and a foot in diameter, arranged in a complex pattern against the side of a rock outcropping. The logs had been placed with obvious intelligence, creating what appeared to be either a shelter or a territorial marker. Some of the logs were bent at angles that should have been impossible without modern equipment, suggesting tremendous strength. At the base of the structure were more signs. Tufts of hair caught on rough bark, each strand coarse and reddish-brown, nearly 8 inches long. Scat that looked mammalian but was far too large to be from any known Alaskan wildlife. And scratches, deep gouges in the bark of nearby trees, at heights of 9 to 10 feet, made by something with considerable reach and power. I collected samples with shaking hands, my scientific training warring with a growing sense of dread. The hair went into a sterile bag, the scat into a sealed container. I photographed everything, checked my compass bearing, recorded the GPS coordinates from my primitive 1987-era handheld unit. Every action was mechanical, automatic, my mind refusing to process the implications of what I was documenting. The sun was setting, that brief winter sunset that lasted mere hours in the Alaskan interior, when I heard the first vocalization. It started low, a rumbling that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a howl that seemed to contain multiple tones simultaneously, like a chord played on an instrument made of flesh and bone. The sound echoed off the mountains, making it impossible to determine direction or distance. It was answered, moments later, by another call from a different location, and then another, and another, until I was surrounded by a chorus of inhuman voices that spoke to each other in a language of wails and thunderous roars. I ran. There is no dignity in admitting this, but it is the truth. I ran through the deepening twilight, my scientific equipment abandoned, my carefully plotted compass bearing forgotten. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, until I burst through the flap of my tent and sealed myself inside with shaking hands. The vocalizations continued for another hour, a conversation held between creatures that should not exist, discussing matters I could not comprehend. When silence finally returned, it was even more oppressive than before. I should have left. Any reasonable person would have activated the emergency beacon, waited for extraction, and returned to civilization with my samples and photographs. But I did not. Perhaps it was professional pride. Perhaps it was the knowledge that no one would believe me without more substantial proof. Or perhaps, and this disturbs me most in retrospect, I was already being influenced by something I did not yet understand. The samples I had collected mocked me from their sealed containers. The hair could be analyzed, but not here, not with my limited field equipment. The photographs were clear but circumstantial. I needed more. I needed direct observation. I needed evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of peer review. On the 8th day, the weather turned. A storm system moved in from the north, bringing wind that howled around the tent like a living thing and snow that fell so thickly I could not see 10 feet beyond the entrance. The temperature plummeted to minus 55 degrees. Under normal circumstances, I would have simply waited out the storm, secure in my shelter with adequate supplies. But these were not normal circumstances. The storm had been raging for perhaps 6 hours when I saw the first shape outside the tent. It was visible only as a disturbance in the blowing snow, a shadow that moved with purpose against the random chaos of the blizzard. Then another shape, and another, until I counted at least 7 distinct figures circling my camp. They were massive. Even through the distortion of the storm, I could see they stood easily 8 or 9 feet tall, their bodies covered in thick fur that shed snow as they moved. They walked upright, with a gait that was almost human but not quite, something in the hip rotation and arm swing that marked them as fundamentally other. They did not approach the tent directly, but maintained a consistent perimeter, as if establishing a boundary I was not permitted to cross. I did not sleep that night. I sat with my back against the support pole of the tent, my useless radio clutched in one hand and my knife in the other, listening to the storm and the sounds that were not quite footsteps circling in the darkness outside. They were keeping me here, not attacking, not threatening overtly, but making it absolutely clear that I was contained. The storm broke with the dawn, that sudden shift from chaos to calm that is characteristic of Arctic weather systems. The wind died, the snow stopped, and the shapes were gone, leaving only tracks in the fresh powder, dozens of them, all around my tent in a perfect circle. Each print was identical to the ones I had photographed days before. I stepped outside into air so cold it felt like broken glass in my lungs and understood with absolute clarity. This had been a message, a demonstration. They wanted me to know I was being watched. They wanted me to know I was powerless. And most disturbing of all, they wanted me to know they could have taken me at any moment, but had chosen not to. The evidence is mounting, and so is the danger. Follow Marcus deeper into the frozen unknown. Subscribe now for the next chapter. Logic suggested I should fear these creatures. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed that I was in mortal danger. But as I studied the pattern of tracks, as I analyzed the precision of their encirclement, I began to understand something that filled me with a different kind of dread. This was not the behavior of animals. This was strategy. This was intelligence. I spent the day reorganizing my camp, checking my supplies, and preparing my equipment for whatever would come next. I no longer harbored any illusions about leaving on my own terms. Something was happening here, something that had been set in motion the moment I arrived, and I was not going to be permitted to leave until it reached its conclusion. As darkness fell on the 9th day, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of sealing myself inside the tent, I built a fire outside, a large one, using precious fuel and what I had collected. I sat beside it, exposed and vulnerable, and I waited. They came as the stars emerged, those impossibly bright stars you only see in places untouched by human light. There were 3 of them this time, approaching from different directions with movements that were coordinated but not synchronized, as if each was independently deciding the same course of action. The largest approached first. It stepped into the circle of firelight, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body covered in thick fur that ranged from reddish-brown to almost black. The face was a disturbing blend of ape and human, with a prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight with an amber glow, and a flat nose above a mouth that seemed too wide. The hands were enormous, easily twice the size of my own, with long fingers that ended in dark nails. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. They were not animal eyes. They held awareness, intelligence, and something that looked disturbingly like judgment. We stared at each other across the fire, predator and prey, though I was no longer certain which was which. The creature made no aggressive moves. It simply studied me, tilting its massive head slightly, as if puzzling out what to make of the small, fragile human who had invaded its territory. Then it did something I did not expect. It sat down. The other 2 emerged from the darkness and sat as well, forming a triangle around the fire with me at one point. We sat there in silence, for being separated by evolution and understanding, united only by the firelight and the immense cold of the Alaskan night. That was when I heard it, not with my ears, but inside my head, a presence that was not quite a voice, but carried meaning nonetheless. Images flooded my consciousness. The valley as it had been hundreds of years ago, teeming with life. The slow encroachment of humans, their machines, and their noise. The retreat of these creatures into smaller and smaller refuges. And beneath it all, a question, simple and devastating. Why? The communication was not like speech. It was deeper, more fundamental, bypassing language entirely and connecting directly to the parts of my brain that processed emotion and memory. I sat paralyzed by the fire, my rational mind struggling to reconcile what was happening with everything I knew about biology, consciousness, and the limits of human experience. The largest creature, which I had begun to think of as the elder, leaned forward slightly. The firelight played across its features, revealing details I had missed in my initial shock. There were scars on its arms and chest, old wounds that spoke of a long and difficult life. Its eyes, which I had thought were simply brown, contained flecks of gold and green, impossibly human in their expressiveness. More images came, flooding my consciousness like a documentary playing at high speed. I saw these creatures living in family groups, teaching their young to forage for roots and hunt small game. I saw them constructing shelters similar to the one I had discovered, using techniques passed down through generations. I saw them communicating through vocalizations, gestures, and something else, that telepathic connection I was experiencing now. But most powerfully, I saw their fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of what humans would do if we discovered them. Through the elders' memories, I witnessed encounters with native peoples, interactions that had been largely peaceful, based on mutual respect and distance. I saw the old agreements, the unspoken boundaries that had kept both species safe. And I saw how those boundaries were collapsing. The 1980s had brought new technology to Alaska. Oil exploration, seismic surveys, increased air traffic, and sport hunting expeditions were pushing deeper into the wilderness. What had once been refuge was becoming prison. The creatures I was facing were not simply hiding from humans. They were being systematically displaced, their ancient territories carved away piece by a species that did not even know they existed. The elder stood suddenly, a movement so fluid and powerful it made me flinch. It turned and gestured to the darkness beyond the firelight. The other two rose as well, flanking me but maintaining a careful distance. It was clear I was being invited, or perhaps commanded, to follow. Every survival instinct I possessed told me to refuse, to stay by the fire, to wait for dawn, and then activate my emergency beacon. But another part of me, the scientist who had devoted his life to understanding the unknown, the part that had brought me to this frozen wilderness in the first place, knew I could not refuse this opportunity. I stood on shaking legs and followed them into the darkness. We walked for what felt like hours, though my disoriented state made it impossible to judge time accurately. The creatures moved through the forest with absolute silence, their massive bodies navigating terrain that I stumbled through clumsily. They adjusted their pace for me, waiting when I fell behind, but never offering assistance. This was a test, I realized, an evaluation of my worthiness to receive what they were about to show me. The forest opened into a valley I had not seen before, one that did not appear on any of my maps. It was sheltered on three sides by steep cliffs, accessible only through a narrow passage we had just traversed. And in that valley, illuminated by moonlight reflecting off snow, I saw the community. There were perhaps 20 structures, similar in construction to the one I had found, but larger, more sophisticated. Some were clearly dwelling places, with openings covered by what looked like woven branches and moss. Others appeared to be storage facilities or communal gathering spaces. I experienced its memories of other refuges lost, other communities scattered. I understood, with crushing clarity, that I was looking at the remnants of a species in terminal decline, clinging to existence in the few places human civilization had not yet consumed. And then came the question, the real purpose of this revelation. It manifested not in words, but in a feeling, a desperate inquiry that carried the weight of survival itself. Will you help us? Marcus stands at the crossroads between science and conscience. What happens next will change everything. Stay with us to discover the truth. The weight of that question nearly drove me to my knees. How could I answer? How could I, a single human, protect an entire hidden species from the inexorable advance of industrial civilization? I was a glaciologist, not a conservationist or a political activist. I had no power, no influence beyond the narrow academic circles of my field. But as I stood there, surrounded by creatures that should not exist, watching their children play in the moonlight, I understood that refusing was not an option. Knowledge carries responsibility. Discovery demands action. I had been chosen, for better or worse, to be the bridge between their world and mine. The elder seemed to sense my internal struggle. It reached out, one massive hand extending toward me, but stopping just short of contact. The gesture was strangely gentle, almost pleading. Another wave of images and emotions washed over me. Trust, fragile and new. Hope, tempered by centuries of disappointment. and fear, profound and justified. They were not asking me to save them. They knew that was beyond anyone's power. What they wanted was more subtle and, in many ways, more difficult. They wanted me to be their witness, their voice, the one who would ensure that if they vanished, they would not vanish silently into the void of forgotten species. But there was a condition delivered with absolute clarity through our strange connection. Could not reveal their location. I could not bring others here. Any proof I gathered would have to be carefully controlled, released in ways that would create awareness without creating a haunt. They had seen what happened when humans found something rare and valuable. They had watched species like themselves become targets, studied, captured, destroyed in the name of science or sport or simple human curiosity. I nodded slowly, the gesture feeling inadequate given the magnitude of what I was agreeing to. The elder held my gaze for a long moment, those amber eyes searching for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps courage I was not sure I possessed. Then it turned and vocalized, a series of low grunts and rumbles that brought the other creatures to attention. What followed was extraordinary. They showed me their world, not as an observer of animals, but as a guest in a society. I was led through the settlement, allowed to see how they lived. I watched them preserve food in ice caches dug deep into the permafrost. I saw their crude but effective tools, implements made from stone and bone that would have looked at home in a human Paleolithic site. I observed their social structures, the way they deferred to elders, protected their young, and resolved disputes through what appeared to be a combination of vocalizations and that telepathic communication. The children approached me with the fearless curiosity of youth, touching my synthetic clothing with wonder, examining my camera and equipment with gentle hands. The adults watched carefully, ready to intervene but allowing the interaction. One of the juveniles, perhaps the equivalent of a human teenager, tried to communicate with me directly, its attempts at mental contact clumsy but earnest. I felt its excitement, its wonder at meeting a human who was not running in fear. As the night wore on, I began to understand the complexity of their situation. They were not simply hiding from humans, they were actively managing our perception of them. The sightings, the footprints, the stories that filtered out from wilderness areas, these were not accidents. They were carefully orchestrated glimpses, enough to maintain the legend, but never enough to confirm the reality. The legend itself was protection, turning them into myth rather than prey. But that protection was failing. As human technology improved, as satellite imagery became more sophisticated, as the wilderness itself shrank, the buffer zone they depended on was disappearing. They needed a new strategy, and somehow, impossibly, I was supposed to be part of it. As dawn approached, the elder led me to one of the larger structures. Inside, illuminated by the pale light filtering through gaps in the construction, I saw what I can only describe as an archive. There were bones, carefully arranged and preserved, from creatures I did not recognize, some bearing tool marks that suggested they had been important to these beings. There were objects, primitive art perhaps, carvings in stone and wood that depicted scenes from their history. And there were symbols scratched into rock surfaces, a form of writing or record-keeping that spoke of a culture far more developed than I had imagined. The elder touched one sequence of symbols, and I felt the history flow into me. These creatures had been here for thousands of years, retreating slowly before human expansion, adapting, surviving, but always diminishing. They had witnessed the arrival of the first humans across the Bering Land Bridge, had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen empires cross the continent. They were the living memory of North America, the indigenous inhabitants who predated even the native peoples we recognized as First Nations. And they were dying, not from disease or predation, but from isolation and declining genetic diversity. This community was one of perhaps 5 remaining, scattered across the most remote regions of the continent. They rarely met, rarely interbred, each group slowly fading into inviolability. In another century, perhaps less, they would be gone. The morning light revealed how exhausted I was, mentally and physically. The elders seemed to recognize this, guiding me back to the edge of the settlement. The telepathic connection faded as we walked, becoming less vivid, until we reached the narrow passage we had entered through. There, the elder stopped and turned to face me one final time. The communication that followed was simpler, more direct. Remember, witness, protect. Then it placed something in my hand, closing my fingers around it before I could see what it was. When I opened my palm, I found a small carved stone, no larger than a coin, depicting a figure that was unmistakably one of them. It was warm from the elder's touch, smoothed by generations of handling. The creature turned and walked back into its hidden valley, leaving me at the threshold between 2 worlds. The journey back to my camp was a blur. I stumbled through the forest in a daze, following tracks that were my own from the night before, barely conscious of direction or distance. When I finally reached my tent, the sun was high, and I had been gone for nearly 18 hours. I collapsed inside, the carved stone clutched in my hand, and slept for the first time in what felt like days. I woke to darkness again, disoriented and uncertain if I had dreamed the entire encounter. But the stone was real, solid in my pocket, and my body ached with the reality of the miles I had walked. More than that, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer the same person who had arrived in this valley 2 weeks ago, armed with scientific certainty and dismissive skepticism. The next 3 days were spent in a frenzy of activity. I reviewed all my photographs, all my samples, all my documentation. The evidence I had gathered was substantial but circumstantial. Hair samples that would show unknown DNA sequences. Photographs of tracks that could be dismissed as hoaxes. Audio recordings of vocalizations that might be attributed to known animals. Nothing that would definitively prove what I had witnessed. Nothing that would protect them if that proof led others to their refuge. I thought carefully about the elders' conditions. I could not reveal the location. I could not guide expeditions here. Any proof I shared had to be controlled, released strategically. But how? How do you convince a skeptical scientific community without providing the evidence they would demand? How do you create awareness without creating a manhunt? The answer, I realized, lay in partial disclosure. I would present evidence of an unknown primate species in Alaska, data suggesting a small, isolated population. I would advocate for preservation of wilderness corridors, for restrictions on development in key areas, but never specify exactly where. The photographs would be released carefully, through channels that would reach the right audiences, environmentalists and conservationists first, the general public later. The legend would be fed, just enough to keep it alive, to create a protective mystery around areas that needed to remain unexplored. It was imperfect. It required me to withhold the most important discoveries of my career, to accept that I would be dismissed as a crank by many colleagues, to sacrifice professional credibility for a promise made in the wilderness. But what choice did I have? I had looked into those amber eyes and seen intelligence, culture, desperation. I had watched their children play and understood that they were not so different from us, that they deserved the same chance at survival we claimed for ourselves. On my final day in the valley, I did something I had never done before. I destroyed data. I erased the GPS coordinates from my equipment, deleted the detailed location markers from my photographs, burned the map that showed the route to the hidden community. It felt like blasphemy, a violation of every principle I had been taught as a scientist. but it was necessary. I kept enough to tell a story, to suggest a mystery, to create questions without providing answers. The hair samples would be analyzed at a private lab, not through official university channels. The photographs would be released anonymously to cryptozoology researchers, people who would appreciate them, but whose lack of mainstream credibility would serve as a buffer. The audio recordings would be sent to wildlife biologists with a simple note, recorded in interior Alaska, identity unknown. When the plane arrived to extract me, piloted by Joseph, who asked no questions about my haunted expression or my sudden eagerness to leave, I carried with me two burdens. The first was the physical evidence, carefully packaged and labeled, incomplete but suggestive. The second was the memory, vivid and undeniable, of a night spent in a hidden valley watching a dying species live its ordinary life with extraordinary grace. The evidence is preserved, but the mission is far from over. Subscribe to follow Marcus as he navigates the dangerous path between revelation and protection. The return to civilization was jarring. Fairbanks, even in February, felt crowded and loud after weeks in the wilderness. I checked into a hotel, spent hours in the shower trying to wash away the accumulated grime and exhaustion, and began the process of re-entry into the academic world. My initial reports to the university were carefully sanitized. The ice core samples were genuine and valuable, providing excellent data on historical climate patterns. I mentioned encountering evidence of unknown wildlife, suggested that the area warranted further biological surveys, but emphasized the extreme difficulty of access and the danger of the terrain. My advisor was pleased with the glaciology results and dismissed the wildlife observations as interesting but outside my area of expertise. The hair samples went to a private genetics lab in Seattle, sent under a pseudonym with cash payment. The results came back 3 weeks later, and I sat in my apartment staring at the report for nearly an hour. The DNA was primate, closely related to human sequences, but with significant divergences suggesting a separation of perhaps 6 million years. It was not ape, not human, but something that had evolved in parallel, adapting to the cold climates of the north while our ancestors adapted to the savannas of Africa. The geneticist who had analyzed the samples called me personally. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice tight with excitement and confusion. "This is extraordinary. We need more samples. We need to know the population size, the geographic range, everything." I told her I had found the hair caught on branches in a remote area, that I could not disclose the exact location, that the sample was all I had. She was frustrated but professional, suggesting we co-author a paper on the findings. I declined, saying I was not ready to publish. She pressed, arguing that this could be the biological discovery of the century. I held firm. After I hung up, I deleted her number from my phone and destroyed the copy of the report I had been sent. The original went into a safety deposit box, along with selected photographs and a detailed journal of my encounter, sealed and dated. If something happened to me, if I disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, the contents would be released to specific environmental organizations I had selected. The photographs began appearing in cryptozoology magazines and newsletters over the following months, always anonymously submitted, always with vague location information. The reaction was mixed. Believers embraced them as vindication, skeptics dismissed them as the latest in a long line of hoaxes. Mainstream scientists ignored them entirely. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a controlled burn of information that raised awareness without triggering expeditions. But the real work was more subtle and took longer. I began attending environmental conferences, making connections with conservation organizations, slowly building a network of allies who could help protect the wilderness areas that mattered most. I never mentioned the Yeti directly, instead focusing on general principles of biodiversity, the importance of preserving large, uninhabited areas, the dangers of fragmenting wildlife corridors. I used my legitimate research as a platform, publishing papers on climate change and its effects on Arctic ecosystems. I became known as an advocate for wilderness preservation, someone who understood the scientific value of leaving some places untouched. When oil companies proposed surveys in interior Alaska, I testified against them, citing environmental concerns that were real but not complete. When the state considered opening new areas to development, I worked with native groups to block the proposals, forming alliances based on shared interest in protecting traditional lands. Years passed. I never returned to that valley, though I thought about it constantly. The carved stone remained on my desk, a smooth, worry stone I would touch during difficult moments, remembering the weight of the promise I had made. I dated, had relationships that never quite worked because I could not fully explain the change that had come over me in 1987. I advanced professionally, became a full professor, earned recognition for my climate research. But always, underneath everything, was the secret, the knowledge of what existed in the wilderness, the responsibility to protect it, the loneliness of being unable to share the most important discovery of my life with anyone who would truly understand. In 1995, 8 years after my encounter, I received a package at my university office. There was no return address, and the postmark was smudged beyond reading. Inside was a single item, a photograph, grainy and taken from a great distance, showing figures moving through a snowy landscape. In the foreground, clearly visible, was a child, one of the young ones I had seen that night. It had grown, but I recognized it. The message was clear. They remembered. They were watching me, just as I had watched them. And they wanted me to know they were still there, still surviving, still hoping that the protection I had promised would hold. I kept that photograph separate from all the others, hidden in a place only I knew. It was too clear, too definitive, too dangerous to ever share. But it gave me something I desperately needed. Confirmation that my sacrifice had meant something, that the species I had witnessed was not yet extinct. I am writing this now, in 2024, as an old man looking back on choices made nearly 4 decades ago. The world has changed in ways I could not have imagined in 1987. Satellite imagery can now resolve objects less than a meter across. Drones can access areas once reachable only by the most arduous expeditions. The wilderness I knew is smaller, more fragmented, more vulnerable. I do not know if they still exist. I have not received another photograph, have not seen any reliable evidence suggesting their continued survival. The silence could mean they have adapted, gone deeper into hiding, found new refuges beyond human reach. Or it could mean the end I feared has finally come, that they faded quietly into extinction while the world remained ignorant of their passing. The hair sample from my 1987 expedition is still in that safety deposit box, along with the sealed journal and the clearest photographs. I have arranged for it to be sent to specific institutions upon my death, a final revelation that may or may not change anything. Perhaps by then, attitudes will have shifted enough that the evidence will be treated with the seriousness it deserves. Perhaps not. What I can say with certainty is this. In February of 1987, I met a species that embodied everything we claim to value about intelligence, family, and survival against overwhelming odds. They asked nothing from us except to be left alone, to be allowed to exist in the margins we have not yet consumed. I spent the rest of my career trying to honor that request, working to preserve wilderness not for abstract principles, but for specific, known inhabitants I could never acknowledge. The question they asked me that night, transmitted through means I still do not fully understand, haunts me still. Why? Why do we destroy? Why do we expand without thought for what is lost? Why do we assume that our form of civilization is the only one worth preserving? I never found adequate answers. I could offer them explanations about human nature, about population pressure and economic systems, and the tragedy of the commons, but these felt like excuses rather than reasons. The truth is simpler and more damning. We destroy because we can, because we are not forced to witness the consequences, because the victims of our expansion are silenced or ignored. The carved stone sits on my desk still, worn smooth by decades of handling. Sometimes, late at night when the rational world of data and proof feels insufficient, I hold it and remember. I remember the weight of the elder's gaze, the sound of children playing in the snow, the feeling of standing at the boundary between what we know and what we refuse to acknowledge. If you are reading this, if these words have reached you through whatever chain of events leads from my writing to your reading, then you are part of the story now. You cannot claim ignorance. You cannot pretend that the wilderness is empty, that the spaces we have not conquered are simply waiting for our use. Somewhere in the vast cold spaces of this continent, in valleys we have not yet mapped and may never reach, there may still be lives being lived according to patterns older than our civilization. They are watching us. They have always been watching us. The question is not whether we will find them, but whether we will leave enough wilderness intact that finding them remains impossible. The question is not whether they exist, but whether we can accept the existence of intelligence that does not advertise itself, that chooses concealment over contact. I made my choice that night in 1987. I chose to be their guardian rather than their discoverer, their protector rather than their exposer. I sacrificed professional recognition, personal relationships, and the simple human desire to share extraordinary experiences. I do not know if it was enough. I will likely die without knowing if my efforts made any difference at all, but I carry the weight of that promise still. Every wild place preserved, every development blocked, every acre of wilderness protected is, in my mind, a small payment on a debt that can never be fully repaid. We owe them more than protection. We owe them acknowledgement of our shared vulnerability, recognition that intelligence comes in forms we do not expect and expresses itself in ways we cannot always understand. The mountain keeps its secrets, and I am just one more person who has chosen to ensure those secrets remain hidden. Until it is too late, or until somehow, impossibly, it is not. This is Marcus Webb's testimony, preserved and shared so that the truth will not die in silence. If you believe that some mysteries deserve protection rather than solution, share this story. Let it be a reminder that the wilderness is not empty, only quiet. And sometimes, in that quiet, the world's most important truths are waiting for those brave enough to listen and wise enough to leave them undisturbed.